The December wind did not just blow through the concrete canyons of the city, it bit. It carried a sharp, frozen malice that seeped through the institutional brick walls of the municipal shelter, settling deep into her aching joints. At 70 years old, this was what life had narrowed down to: a cot with a sagging mattress, a thin wool blanket that smelled aggressively of industrial bleach, and the suffocating realization of absolute invisibility. To the city outside, she was just another shadow shifting in the background, a minor statistical inconvenience on a cold night. Inside the shelter, the air was heavy with the collective sigh of 100 defeated souls, a symphony of hacking coughs and muttered regrets. She kept her eyes fixed on the cracked linoleum floor, avoiding the desperate territorial stares of the younger residents. Dignity was the first thing the streets stripped from a person, peeled away in layers until even looking someone in the eye felt like a liability. Her entire existence, the sum of 7 decades of memories, triumphs, and heartbreaks, was now ruthlessly compressed into 2 mismatched canvas duffel bags. One served as her pillow, guarded with a fierce primal instinct even in her sleep. The other was tucked tightly between her frail ankles. Inside those bags were no riches, no expensive keepsakes, just the practical remnants of a discarded life, a few changes of oversized clothes, a plastic comb, and a pair of worn-out sneakers. The struggle for survival at her age was not a dramatic cinematic battle. It was a slow, grinding war of attrition. It was the mathematical calculation of whether her lungs could handle the 2-mile walk to the soup kitchen in sub-zero temperatures, or if her knees would buckle before she reached the front of the line. Every day was an exercise in swallowing what little pride she had left, holding out a trembling hand for a paper cup of lukewarm broth, while passers-by deliberately looked at their phones to avoid acknowledging her humanity. They did not see the woman who had once managed a household, who had paid taxes, and who had loved deeply. They saw a ghost. As a sudden draft rattled the frosted window pane, a shiver ripped through her thin frame. She pulled the scratchy blanket tighter around her shoulders, but the chill seemed to radiate from the inside out. In the bleak darkness of the shelter's common room, where the overhead fluorescent lights were dimmed to a ghostly hum, fear began to tighten its familiar grip around her chest. The terrifying thought that this cot might be her final resting place, that she would die completely unremembered, threatened to pull her under. Desperate for an anchor, her trembling fingers reached deep into the unzipped front pocket of the duffel bag beneath her head. Her hand brushed against a familiar, reassuring texture. She pulled it out carefully, treating it like a sacred artifact amid the surrounding squalor. It was her late father's Bible. The book was a relic of a different lifetime, its black leather cover deeply creased, scuffed at the corners, and smoothed out by decades of her father's calloused hands. The spine was fragile, held together by faded black tape, yet it possessed a weight that defied its physical dimensions. For her, this book was not just a religious text. It was a tangible piece of a time when she had a name that was spoken with affection, a home filled with the scent of pine wood, and a father who promised her that no winter lasted forever. She brought the heavy book close to her chest, hugging it against her ribs as if it could shield her from the piercing cold. The faint, musty scent of old paper and familiar tobacco smoke still lingered faintly within the pages, a fleeting ghost of her childhood comfort. In a room filled with people who had lost everything, she clutched that worn leather block like a shield against the dark. Her thumb traced the gold-embossed lettering on the cover, now mostly faded into the black hide. She did not open it yet. The darkness was too heavy, and her eyes were too tired. But the sheer presence of her father's legacy in her hands brought a sudden, unexpected stillness to her racing heart. The storm outside continued to howl, shaking the very foundations of the shelter, but for the first time in months, she stopped trembling. The morning sun offered no warmth, only a harsh, blinding glare off the frozen sidewalks as she made her way to the city's public library. It was the only sanctuary left for people like her, a place where admission cost nothing and the heating was free. She sat at a secluded wooden table in the far corner of the history section, tucked away from the watchful eyes of the security guards who frowned at overcoats that looked too heavy or bags that looked too full. The air here was quiet, thick with the comforting, dusty smell of old paper. She set her 2 duffel bags carefully beside her chair and placed her father's Bible on the table. Under the dim, flickering fluorescent light, that buzzed like a trapped insect overhead. She finally let out the breath she had been holding since dawn. Her hands were still stiff from the walk, the skin on her knuckles red and raw. She opened the fragile leather cover, seeking nothing more than a familiar verse to anchor her drifting mind. The pages were thin as onion skin, softened by time, and marked with her father's occasional neat, penciled underlinings. She turned the pages slowly, letting the rhythmic rustle of the paper soothe the residual panic of the shelter. But as she reached the middle of the Old Testament, entering the book of Exodus, the natural giveaway of the book changed. The spine resisted. The pages refused to lay flat, jammed open by a stiffness that didn't belong to the fragile paper. Intrigued, she slipped her thin fingers between the heavy sheets. Tucked deep within the text, hidden precisely where the Israelites began their journey out of the wilderness, was a thick, folded piece of parchment. It was crisp, completely unlike the surrounding pages, preserved perfectly from the oils of human hands for decades. She pulled it out with trembling care. It was a heavy, linen-bound paper, yellowed beautifully around the edges by the slow march of time, bearing an official embossed gold seal that caught the weak library light. She unfolded it. The document was a land ownership certificate dating back to the winter of 1954, signed in faded blue fountain pen ink. Her father's name was written across the top in bold, elegant calligraphy. As her eyes scanned the legal descriptions, the coordinates, and the plat maps detailed on the parchment, a profound stillness settled over her. For 50 years, her family had believed he died penniless, leaving them to a slow, generational slide into poverty that eventually washed her up on the shores of homelessness. They had thought his final years were spent in financial ruin, swallowed by bad luck and broken promises. The document in her hands proved the exact opposite. Her father hadn't abandoned them to fate. He had secured their future in the quietest, most enduring way possible. According to the deed, he had purchased a massive 80-acre tract of land on what had once been the undeveloped rural outskirts of the city. He had specifically zoned it for industrial use, a forward-thinking gamble on a future he knew he wouldn't live to see. She stared at the modern map printed on the library's promotional brochure sitting on the table, comparing the old coordinates to the present day. Her breath hitched. The rural outskirts of 1954 were no longer countryside. That forgotten patch of dirt was now the exact epicenter of the city's booming tech and logistics corridor, flanked by massive shipping hubs and soaring corporate parks. It was a prime, untouched industrial gold mine sitting right beneath the city's nose, worth millions of dollars in today's market. A sudden, overwhelming warmth rushed through her veins, chasing away the deep, structural chill of the shelter. She wasn't a beggar. She wasn't an invisible ghost destined to freeze on a city cot. She was the rightful owner of an empire waiting to be claimed. Her father had left her a map out of her own wilderness, folded neatly inside the promises of his faith, waiting for the exact moment she needed it most. She folded the certificate back up, her grip tight and resolute, and tucked it safely inside her coat pocket next to her heart. The fight wasn't over, but the rules of the game had just completely changed. The city bus dropped her off at the edge of the asphalt grid, where the sleek, glass and steel monoliths of the tech corridor abruptly met a wall of rusted chain-link fence. She stood on the gravel shoulder, her 2 duffel bags anchored at her feet, staring at the 80 acres that belonged to her. The land was a defiant, wild island of desolation, trapped in a sea of aggressive modernization. Towering weeds, skeletal remains of old oak trees, and patches of frozen, unplowed mud stretched across the valley. Massive, multi-million-dollar fulfillment centers hummed directly across the eastern border, their autonomous delivery trucks droning like giant metallic bees. To the west, a glittering corporate campus cast its long shadow across her family's dirt. It looked abandoned, a forgotten scar on the city's face, but to her eyes, it was beautiful. It was raw, unblemished potential. She walked toward an old, rusted iron gate that choked under a thick knot of dead vines. Before her hand could even touch the metal, the sharp crunch of expensive leather shoes on gravel shattered the silence. From the shadow of a sleek, black luxury SUV, parked illegally on the shoulder, 3 figures approached. At the center was a man in his early 40s, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that defied the freezing temperature, his hair slicked back with clinical precision. His eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of empathy, the look of a man who viewed the world exclusively in terms of margins and acquisitions. He was flanked by two associates carrying leather briefcases, their expressions masked behind expensive sunglasses. They moved with the unearned confidence of apex predators who had spent years circling a carcass, waiting for the right moment to strike. The man in the charcoal suit smiled, but it was a theatrical, predatory gesture that didn't reach his eyes. He introduced himself as the managing partner of Vanguard Development Group, a conglomerate that had spent the last 7 years attempting to claim this exact plot through adverse possession. They had filed the paperwork, cited the land as an abandoned civic hazard, and were only weeks away from a quiet judicial rubber stamp that would absorb the acreage into their corporate portfolio for next to nothing. They had assumed the original owner was a ghost, a long-dead name with no bloodline left to fight back. They certainly hadn't expected a 70-year-old woman with 2 duffel bags and a faded winter coat to step off a public bus and stand in their way. Without offering a greeting, the man gestured toward the overgrown wilderness behind the fence. He spoke in a smooth, practiced cadence, painting a picture of a useless, toxic eyesore that would cost a fortune to clear, survey, and develop. He pointed out the imaginary liabilities, the environmental fines, and the bureaucratic nightmares that would surely crush someone of her age and economic standing. Then, with a dramatic flourish, one of his associates stepped forward, opening a leather portfolio to reveal a printed contract and a cashier's check. The offer was $500,000. To anyone living in a homeless shelter, it was an astronomical, life-changing sum. It was enough to buy a modest condo, secure 3 meals a day for the rest of her life, and never have to worry about the winter cold again. The developer slid a heavy, engraved pen across the folder, his smile widening. He told her it was an act of corporate charity, a generous buyout for a piece of useless dirt, and a chance for her to retire in comfort rather than die invisible. He spoke as if he were doing her a favor, condescendingly assuming she would grab the check with trembling, grateful hands. She looked at the check, then looked past the men to the sprawling industrial horizon. She could see exactly what they saw. This land wasn't a liability. It was the crown jewel of the entire logistics district. By securing this plot, Vanguard Development would control the main transit artery connecting the rail lines to the interstate. $500,000 wasn't a generous offer. It was a microscopic fraction of the land's true value, a desperate, low-ball attempt to rob her of her birthright before she realized what she actually held. But more than the money, she looked at the dirt and remembered the weight of the Bible in her hands the night before. This wasn't just real estate. This was her father's vision, a silent promise kept alive through decades of obscurity. If she signed that paper, she would be validating every person who had ever looked past her on the street. She would be agreeing that her family's legacy was worth nothing more than a quick, quiet payoff to clear the way for corporate greed. A profound, unbreakable calm settled over her. The frailty that had defined her movements for the last several years vanished, replaced by a steel-spined resolve. She looked the developer dead in the eye, her gaze so sharp and unwavering that his practiced smile faltered. She did not touch the pen. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket, her fingers brushing against the crisp parchment of the 1954 certificate. She didn't even take it out. The sheer knowledge of its presence was enough. She looked at the charcoal suit and spoke, her voice clear, resonant, and entirely devoid of the fear they expected. She told him that the land was not for sale. Not today, not for 500,000, and not for 5 million. The developer's face hardened, the mask of civility slipping away to reveal a cold, venomous arrogance. He warned her that she was playing a dangerous game, that a woman in her position didn't have the capital, the legal muscle, or the time to fight a multi-billion-dollar corporation in court. He reminded her that building on industrial land required millions in upfront infrastructure, permits, and political leverage, things an old woman living out of duffel bags could never possess. He told her she would drown in the legal fees alone before a single brick was laid. She didn't blink. She picked up her bags, her grip firm and unyielding. She told him that she had already survived the worst the city could throw at her, and that a corporate boardroom was nothing compared to a freezing December night on concrete. She wasn't going to sell her father's legacy to line the pockets of men who didn't care if she lived or died. She was going to step onto that dirt, claim her inheritance, and build an industrial empire that would dwarf everything they had ever created. She turned her back on the executives, leaving them standing on the gravel shoulder with their useless check, and walked toward the gate. The true battle for her empire had just begun, and she was ready. To fight a war against a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate, she needed a blueprint, and that required an architect. She found him in the cramped basement office of a fading brick building on the forgotten edge of downtown. The air in the room was thick with the scent of stale coffee and damp blueprints, illuminated only by the harsh glow of a dual-monitor setup and a single desk lamp. At 30, he looked like a man who had already been thoroughly chewed up and spit out by the American dream. His desk was buried under an avalanche of past-due notices, student loan statements, and rejection letters from high-end firms. He had entered the profession wanting to design sustainable masterpieces that would change the world, but reality had reduced him to drawing cheap strip mall renovations just to keep the lights on. He was cynical, disillusioned, and deeply weary, staring at his computer screen with a vacant expression when the bell above the door rattled. He didn't look up immediately, assuming she was just another lost soul seeking refuge from the biting cold outside. But when she marched straight to his desk, set her two heavy canvas duffel bags firmly on the floor, and sat in the squeaky plastic chair opposite him, he finally raised his eyes. He saw a 70-year-old woman in a faded winter coat, but there was a fierce, sharp intensity in her gaze that immediately arrested his attention. Before he could utter a polite dismissal, she reached into her coat pocket, extracted the crisp, yellowed 1954 land certificate, and laid it flat on his desk over his stack of bills. Alongside it, she placed a battered, leather-bound journal filled with detailed, hand-drawn schematics. He frowned. His professional curiosity piqued despite his cynicism. He pulled the journal closer, turning the pages with growing astonishment. The sketches belonged to her late father, brilliant, visionary concepts for automated, modular assembly plants that were decades ahead of their time. The designs utilized geometric efficiency and natural light, concepts that modern industrial architects were only now beginning to master. She began to speak, her voice steady and commanding, explaining the layout of her 80-acre plot in the tech corridor. She didn't speak like an amateur. She spoke with a precise, intuitive understanding of logistics, structural scale, and operational flow. He listened, completely transfixed, as this unhoused woman outlined a multi-million-dollar industrial vision with the sharp, calculated focus of a seasoned CEO. He leaned back, a bitter laugh escaping his lips as he pointed out the harsh reality of her situation. He reminded her that the corporate sharks at Vanguard Development would tie her up in zoning litigation for years, and that even if she broke ground, a project of this scale required massive capital. He admitted that his own bank account was empty, that his license was the only thing he had left, and that no traditional bank would ever approve a commercial loan for an elderly woman with no credit history and a broke architect. He told her it was a beautiful dream, but ultimately suicide. She didn't blink. She looked at his overdue notices, then looked him dead in the eye, telling him that traditional paths were built for people who had the luxury of time. She wasn't asking him to buy into a dream. She was offering him the chance to build a monument that would make every firm that rejected him regret it. She proposed a partnership. She couldn't pay his hourly rate today, but she was offering him 5% equity in a manufacturing empire that didn't exist yet, secured by 80 acres of the most valuable industrial dirt in the state. There was a long, heavy silence in the basement office. He looked at the brilliant sketches in the journal, then at the absolute, unshakable conviction radiating from her eyes. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of the passion that had driven him to architecture in the first place. He realized that this extraordinary woman wasn't just a survivor, she was a force of nature. He reached across the desk, his grip firm, and accepted the deal. The partnership was forged in the shadows of debt and poverty, driven by a shared, defiant hunger to prove the world wrong. They immediately went to work, ignoring the traditional financial institutions that would have locked them out. Instead, they drafted a radical, aggressive strategy to leverage the land itself as collateral for alternative funding. He stayed up for 3 consecutive nights, converting her father's historic sketches into cutting-edge, 3-dimensional digital renderings. They didn't design a standard polluting factory. They designed a revolutionary, zero-emission, eco-industrial manufacturing hub featuring solar harvesting facades and advanced rainwater recycling loops. Armed with these revolutionary designs, they bypassed the commercial banks and targeted federal and state green energy infrastructure grants. They applied for specialized brownfield revitalization funds and eco-industrial innovation subsidies designed to reward sustainable development. Because her land was free and clear of mortgages, they used its multi-million-dollar appraisal value to satisfy the strict matching funds requirements of the grants. By the end of the week, they had submitted a bulletproof high-tech proposal that the state government couldn't ignore. They had turned her inheritance from a piece of overgrown dirt into an unstoppable financial engine, building the foundation of her empire without borrowing a single dime from Wall Street. The roar of diesel engines and the rhythmic slam of pile drivers shattered the morning silence across the 80-acre valley. By the spring of her 71st year, the desolate patch of overgrown weeds had been completely transformed into a high-stakes, hyper-efficient construction zone. At the center of the chaotic grid of yellow excavators and pouring concrete stood she, a sharp contrast to the raw steel around her. Clad in a neon-orange safety vest, steel-toed boots, and a scuffed white hard hat, she was on site every single morning before the first generator sputtered to life. She didn't supervise from the comfort of a temporary trailer. She walked the muddy trenches, her sharp eyes tracking every steel rebar placement and every foundation pour, cross-referencing them with the digital tablet he had synced to her father's original modular designs. The strategy they had deployed was a calculated, brilliant gamble that had completely blindsided the local manufacturing sector. Instead of entering the crowded, cutthroat market of traditional plastics or heavy machining, she had pivoted the company's entire focus toward next-generation, high-margin green tech manufacturing. Her first facility was designed explicitly to mass-produce advanced, biodegradable supply chain packaging, a highly proprietary, seaweed and hemp-based polymer that could seamlessly replace petroleum-based plastics for global logistics giants. It was a multi-billion-dollar market sector starved for innovation. By aligning her father's automated modular assembly layouts with sustainable, zero-emission production lines, she wasn't just building a factory, she was positioning her company as the ultimate green artery for the entire tech corridor surrounding her. But the rapid, independent rise of her enterprise had painted a massive target on her back. Vanguard Development Group, humiliated by her refusal to sell and furious that she had bypassed their financial chokeholds through government eco-grants, decided to strike where she was most vulnerable, her supply chain. The hurdle came with devastating suddenness, just as the main structural steel frames were being erected. On a Tuesday afternoon, he ran out to the foundation site, his face pale as he looked up from his phone. 3 of their primary domestic suppliers for the raw, treated agricultural fiber required for their initial production test runs had abruptly canceled their contracts, citing sudden capacity shortages. It was a coordinated corporate ambush. Vanguard had quietly leveraged its massive industrial network, buying out the exclusive distribution rights of those suppliers and threatening to pull their own massive logistics contracts if anyone sold so much as a pound of raw material to her startup. Without those materials, her high-tech machinery would sit idle, a multi-million-dollar paperweight, causing her to miss the strict production deadlines locked into her state infrastructure grants. If she missed those deadlines, the grant funding would freeze, collapsing the entire project before the roof was even finished. The corporate sharks expected her to panic, to come crawling back to the negotiation table with her head bowed. They underestimated the raw, adaptive resilience of a woman who had survived the brutal psychology of the streets. While he scrambled to find alternative domestic distributors, only to hit a wall of corporate non-disclosure agreements and manufactured delays, she sat in the construction trailer, staring at a map of global trade routes. She knew that a direct frontal assault against a conglomerate's domestic monopoly was a losing battle. She needed to flank them. Instead of begging local suppliers, she utilized her sharp, calculated focus to look across the border. She discovered that a massive agricultural cooperative in eastern Canada was holding a massive surplus of industrial hemp fiber due to a localized trade dispute that had blocked their European exports. The material was identical in quality, but because of the cooperative's current logistical gridlock, it was priced significantly lower than the domestic options, even when accounting for international rail freight costs. She didn't waste an hour. She bypassed traditional maritime shipping lanes, which Vanguard could easily monitor and manipulate through their port connections, and directly negotiated an exclusive, multi-year import deal with the Canadian cooperative. She leveraged the value of her land once more, securing a short-term customs bond that guaranteed immediate clearance at the northern border. To ensure the corporate sharks couldn't interfere with the transit, she arranged for the raw materials to be shipped via a secondary, independent rail line that connected directly to a private offloading spur running along the western edge of her own property. When the first massive cargo train roared to a halt on her property line, its cars stacked high with the raw materials needed to fuel her empire, she stood on the loading dock next to him. She watched the heavy bundles of fiber being unloaded into her newly minted storage bays, a faint, cold smile playing on her lips. Vanguard's multi-million-dollar sabotage had not only failed, it had inadvertently forced her to streamline her supply chain, cutting her production costs by 20% and securing a permanent, international material pipeline that her competitors couldn't touch. The foundation was set, the materials were secured, and the machines were about to wake up. The rhythmic, synchronized hum of automated assembly lines finally breathed life into the massive steel structure. Inside the pristine, sunlit facility, specialized machinery spun the imported Canadian fibers into flawless, biodegradable shipping pallets and smart packaging modules. It was a marvel of modern engineering, but the true revolutionary heart of the operation lay not in the technology, but in the people operating it. When the time came to staff her first production line, she did not hire through traditional corporate recruiting agencies or poach talent from her competitors. Instead, she took a company van back to the municipal shelters, the crowded church basements, and the forgotten corners of the city where she had once spent her coldest nights. She implemented an employment model that the traditional business world dismissed as a naive, financially ruinous charity project. She opened her doors exclusively to the unhoused, the elderly, and the economically discarded, individuals whose resumes had been blacklisted by society due to age, gaps in employment, or the simple misfortune of poverty. But she did not offer them charity. She offered them a covenant. She provided them with a starting wage that significantly exceeded the state standard, comprehensive health care, and most importantly, dignity. Built directly adjacent to the factory floor was a modern, sustainable residential complex featuring private, micro-apartment units, a communal dining hall, and an on-site medical clinic. She built a sanctuary where her workers could transition off the streets without the terror of housing insecurity. The traditional corporate sharks predicted that a workforce built from society's margins would collapse under absenteeism and inefficiency. They were proven wrong within the first fiscal quarter. The loyalty, fierce work ethic, and meticulous dedication of her employees turned the facility into the most efficient, low-turnover production plant in the entire logistics corridor. They weren't just working for a paycheck, they were defending the woman who had restored their humanity. The market demand for her sustainable packaging skyrocketed as global e-commerce giants faced intense consumer pressure to eliminate petroleum plastics. Because her production costs were 20% lower thanks to her streamlined Canadian supply chain, her profit margins were ironclad. Within 18 months, the single factory module was running 24 hours a day, completely incapable of keeping up with the avalanche of purchase orders. She did not hoard the incoming capital. She weaponized it for an aggressive, hyper-accelerated expansion strategy that utilized her father's modular designs to their fullest potential. Because the factory blueprints he had rendered were entirely scalable, they could be replicated with mathematical precision in a fraction of the time it took to build traditional industrial plants. Within 3 years, the single facility on the outskirts of the city replicated into a sprawling, interconnected manufacturing empire stretching across 3 states. Wherever a rusted, decaying Rust Belt town had been abandoned by old money manufacturing conglomerates, she stepped in. She purchased shuttered automotive plants and dying textile mills in neighboring states, retrofitting them into high-tech, eco-friendly packaging hubs. In every new city, she deployed the exact same human-centric blueprint, building on-site housing and revitalizing depressed local economies by hiring the forgotten workforce that the modern economy had left behind. By her 74th year, she had ceased to be an anomaly. She was an institution. The woman who had once guarded a canvas duffel bag in a crowded shelter was now the undisputed chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar industrial juggernaut. Her face, lined with the wisdom of a long, hard-fought life, appeared on the covers of major American business magazines. Wall Street analysts struggled to comprehend how a startup had managed to disrupt a legacy sector so completely without institutional debt. They called it an economic miracle, but to her, it was simply the logical conclusion of a daughter honoring her father's vision, executed by a workforce that had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. She had built a machine fueled by resilience, and its momentum was now entirely unstoppable. The grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Hotel was a glittering sea of crystal chandeliers, tailored tuxedos, and silk gowns. It was the city's annual industrial gala, an exclusive gathering of the region's old money elite, political power brokers, and real estate barons. Yet tonight, the center of gravity had shifted entirely. When she entered the room, a collective, respectful hush rippled through the crowd. At 75, she moved with an innate, quiet sovereignty that no amount of inherited wealth could buy. She wore a simple, elegant midnight blue gown, her silver hair styled neatly, her posture perfectly erect. Walking half a step behind her was him, her trusted chief operating officer, looking sharp and commanding in a black tuxedo. They were no longer the desperate outcasts hiding in a public library. They were the architects of a new industrial era. As they neared the VIP lounge, three familiar figures stepped forward, deliberately blocking their path. It was the executive team from Vanguard Development Group, led by the same man in the charcoal suit who had tried to rob her on a gravel shoulder 4 years ago. The predatory arrogance that had once defined him was completely gone, replaced by a nervous, deferential smile. He held out an expensive glass of champagne toward her, his hands trembling slightly under her cool, penetrating gaze. Without missing a beat, he began to pitch a massive joint venture proposal, offering her company exclusive development rights to Vanguard's entire portfolio of commercial properties. The very corporate sharks who had attempted to steal her land through adverse possession and ruin her supply lines were now publicly begging for her partnership, desperate to save their own failing logistics hubs from obsolescence. She did not accept the champagne. She didn't even look at the proposal. She simply offered him a faint, knowing smile that made his face go pale, then walked past him toward the main stage, leaving him standing humiliated in the center of the ballroom. When her name was called as the keynote speaker, the applause was deafening, a roaring standing ovation from a boardroom elite that had once rendered her invisible. She stepped up to the mahogany podium, looking out over the crowded ballroom. For a brief moment, she didn't see the glittering diamonds or the expensive suits. She saw the cold, gray walls of the municipal shelter, the frozen faces of the people she had slept beside, and the heavy leather spine of her father's Bible. She spoke without notes, her voice clear, resonant, and carrying a raw, magnetic authority that held the room captive. She did not boast about her multi-million-dollar profit margins or her expanding network of factories across 3 states. Instead, she addressed the deep, systemic rot of traditional American industry. She told the crowded room of executives that their definition of a legacy was fundamentally broken. She argued that true corporate power was not measured by the size of an extraction margin, the ruthlessness of a hostile takeover, or the emptiness of a luxury portfolio. She stated that a real legacy is not merely the wealth you inherit from the past, but the sanctuary you build for those who have been left behind by the present. She described how her factories had taken the broken, the unhoused, and the forgotten, the very people this ballroom viewed as statistical liabilities, and turned them into the backbone of a green industrial revolution. She challenged every CEO in the room to look out their high-rise windows and see the human potential sleeping on the concrete below. When she finished, she looked directly at the Vanguard executives in the back, declaring that her father's dirt was never meant to be a playground for corporate greed. It was meant to be a foundation for human redemption. She stepped away from the podium into a thunderous, reverent silence that quickly fractured into a standing ovation, her spirit completely and beautifully vindicated. The soft, golden light of late afternoon flooded through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of her top-floor executive office. From this vantage point, high above the bustling transit arteries of the tech corridor, the world looked serene. Below her, the 80-acre valley that had once been an overgrown graveyard of broken dreams was now a masterpiece of industrial harmony. She stood by the window, a warm mug of tea cradled in her hands, watching the shift change. Hundreds of workers streamed out of the modular facility, their faces bright, laughing as they walked the short, landscaped path toward the adjacent residential village. The sleek, solar-harvesting roofs of her factories gleamed under the twilight sky, humming with a quiet, efficient energy that felt less like a mechanical roar and more like a steady heartbeat. At 75, the structural exhaustion that had once weighed down her bones was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, immovable peace. She had won the war. The corporate sharks had retreated, the supply lines were ironclad, and her eco-friendly manufacturing empire was now a blueprint being studied by economists worldwide. But as she looked down at the thriving community below, she knew that the true victory wasn't the millions flowing into the company accounts or the accolades sitting on her mahogany desk. The victory was the laughter of the men and women on the tarmac. It was the children playing on the green lawns of the housing complex. It was the simple, profound reality that hundreds of souls, who had once been invisible to the world, now had a key to their own front door, a living wage, and a safe place to rest their heads. The door to her office clicked open softly. He walked in, carrying a final stack of quarterly reports, his expression relaxed and deeply content. The cynical, debt-ridden young architect from the crumbling basement office had transformed into a brilliant corporate leader, his eyes now bright with purpose and pride. He didn't say a word. He simply stood beside her, looking out at the empire they had built together from a yellowed piece of parchment and a leap of faith. She turned to him, offering a gentle smile of profound gratitude, and handed him the final signed expansion permits for their fourth state facility. Their partnership had redefined what it meant to build in America. Holding her father's worn, leather-bound Bible in her hands one last time, she walked out of her office and rode the glass elevator down to the grand corporate lobby. The space was beautiful, designed by him to be open, airy, and flooded with natural light, a stark contrast to the dim, suffocating shelters of her past. At the center of the atrium stood a custom-built, illuminated glass display case, flanked by the original hand-drawn architectural blueprints her father had sketched in his journal decades ago. With steady, reverent hands, she opened the display case and placed the fragile Bible inside, open to the very pages of Exodus where she had discovered her path out of the wilderness. She adjusted the spotlight above it, ensuring that the scuffed black leather and the faded gold lettering were visible to every employee, every client, and every visitor who walked through those doors. She stood back, leaning against the glass, letting a final, deep sigh escape her chest. The long, freezing winter of her life was officially over. She hadn't just survived the streets. She hadn't just clawed her way out of the darkness to save herself. She had weaponized her father's forgotten legacy to build a permanent, industrial sanctuary, a fortress of stone, steel, and human dignity that ensured no one else would ever have to endure the cold alone. Looking at the Bible resting safely within the heart of her empire, she knew her father's promise had been kept, and her legacy was finally solidified.